Hey there! Tonight we're stepping away from the gleaming laboratories and precise instruments of modern medicine into something far more unsettling. The shadowy chambers where healers mix blood with superstition, where cures killed more often than they saved, and where the very act of seeking help could seal your fate. This is medieval medicine, the real kind. No miracle remedies or gentle herbalists, just centuries of well-intentioned torture disguised as healing. If this kind of slow, grounded history helps you drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you that sleepy peace you're looking for. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. There's something oddly comforting about knowing others are out there, settling into the same dark tales of humanity's misguided attempts to mend what's broken. So dim the lights, maybe pull that blanket a little tighter. Let the weight of centuries settle around you like dust in an old apothecary's shop. And let's begin with the physicians who believed they were saving lives while systematically destroying them. You don't become a medieval doctor because you understand the human body. You become one because you've memorized the right texts, learned the proper prayers, and convinced enough people that your confident ignorance is somehow better than their desperate uncertainty. The path to healing, such as it was, began not in observation or experimentation, but in the scriptorium. Medical knowledge in the medieval world was a strange inheritance. Ancient Greek and Roman texts filtered through Islamic scholars, translated into Latin by monks who'd never seen a dissection, then copied by scribes who couldn't tell a kidney from a turnip. Each translation added new errors, new assumptions, new ways to misunderstand the human form. By the time these texts reached the universities of Paris or Bologna, they bore about as much resemblance to actual medicine as a children's drawing bears to architecture. The dominant medical theory wasn't based on what doctors could see, but on what ancient authorities had declared must be true. Galen, the Roman physician whose work became gospel, had performed his dissections on pigs and monkeys, then extrapolated wildly about human anatomy. For over 1,000 years, no one thought to check his work. Why would they? The ancients had already figured everything out. And so medieval physicians learned that the body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these humours were in perfect balance. Illness meant they were out of whack. The solution was always the same: restore the balance through purging, bloodletting, or introducing substances that would counteract the excess humour. It was elegant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its results. The typical medieval physician dressed the part beautifully. Long robes, often in rich colours that suggested both learning and prosperity, a pointed hat that added gravity to his pronouncements, sometimes a staff or rod of office. He looked like wisdom incarnate, which was crucial because looking wise was often the only qualification he possessed. His medical bag contained an astrolabe for calculating the influence of stars on his patient's condition, jars of exotic powders with names like dragon's blood and unicorn horn, and instruments that seemed designed more for torture than healing. When you fell ill in medieval times, you didn't call a doctor immediately. Doctors were expensive, and most people couldn't afford their services. Instead, you tried home remedies first. Herbal teas brewed by your grandmother, prayers muttered over your bedside, charms hung around your neck. If you were lucky, these folk remedies might actually help. They were often based on centuries of trial and error, and some contained genuinely beneficial compounds. But when home remedies failed, when the fever wouldn't break or the pain wouldn't stop, that's when families scraped together enough coin to summon the physician. His arrival was both hope and harbinger. Hope that his learning might save you. Harbinger because his treatments were often worse than the disease. The consultation began with questions, but not the kind you might expect. The physician wanted to know when you were born so he could cast your horoscope. He studied your urine not for signs of infection or disease, but for its colour and consistency, which he believed revealed the state of your humours. He might taste it, swirling it around his mouth like a wine connoisseur sampling a vintage. The diagnosis that followed was always confident, always complex. and almost always wrong. Medieval physicians had elaborate explanations for everything. A fever wasn't caused by infection, but by an excess of hot, moist humours that needed to be cooled and dried. A cough wasn't the result of respiratory illness, but of phlegm that had become corrupted and needed to be expelled. Melancholy wasn't a mood disorder, but a literal excess of black bile that was poisoning the mind. Every symptom fit neatly into their theoretical framework, which would have been impressive if their framework bore any resemblance to reality. The treatments that followed were systematic and brutal. Bloodletting was the most common, based on the belief that removing blood would reduce the pressure of excess humours. Physicians had charts showing exactly where to cut based on the patient's symptoms and astrological sign. They used everything from simple knives to elaborate cupping devices that would draw blood to the surface of the skin. The amount of blood removed was often staggering, sometimes several pints from a patient who was already weakened by illness. Purging was equally popular. Physicians administered powerful laxatives and emetics that would empty the patient's stomach and bowels violently. The theory was that this would expel the corrupted humours causing the illness. In practice, it left patients dehydrated and malnourished, their bodies less able to fight off whatever was actually making them sick. But the physicians saw the violent purging as proof that their treatment was working, that the bad humours were being expelled. Then there were the more exotic treatments. Trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in the skull, was used to treat headaches, epilepsy, and mental illness. The theory was that evil spirits or corrupted humours were trapped inside the head and needed a way to escape. Some patients actually survived this procedure, though whether they were helped or harmed is debatable. The holes in their skulls often became infected, leading to new problems that required new treatments. Physicians also prescribed complex compounds made from dozens of ingredients. Theriac, a legendary cure-all, contained over 60 different components, including viper's flesh, opium, and various spices. The recipe was jealously guarded, passed down through generations of physicians who believed they were preserving ancient wisdom. In reality, theriac was probably harmless, which made it one of the safer treatments available. The wealthy could afford private physicians, men who had studied at universities and could recite Galen and Avicenna from memory. These doctors charged enormous fees for their services, but their treatments were no more effective than those of village healers. In fact, they were often more dangerous because university-trained physicians had access to more powerful drugs and surgical instruments. The poor relied on barber surgeons, craftsmen who combined haircutting with basic medical procedures. They performed bloodletting, tooth extraction, and simple surgery. Their training was practical rather than theoretical, learned through apprenticeship rather than study. Paradoxically, this sometimes made them more effective than their university-educated counterparts because they at least had hands-on experience with the human body. Hospitals existed, but they were more like hostels than medical facilities. Run by religious orders, they provided food and shelter to the sick, but little in the way of actual treatment. The monks and nuns who staffed them were motivated by Christian charity rather than medical knowledge. They offered prayers, clean beds, and basic nursing care, which was often more helpful than the interventions of trained physicians. The practice of dissection was forbidden for most of the medieval period, based on religious beliefs about the sanctity of the human body. When it was finally allowed in universities, it was conducted as a formal ritual. A professor would read from ancient texts while a barber surgeon did the actual cutting. The professor never looked at the body directly, relying instead on what the book said should be there. If the anatomy didn't match the text, it was assumed that this particular body was abnormal, not that the text might be wrong. This willful blindness to observable reality was one of the most striking features of medieval medicine. Physicians had access to the same information as their patients about what treatments worked and what didn't. They could see that bloodletting often made patients worse, that purging weakened the sick, that their elaborate compounds rarely produced cures. But they explained away these failures as exceptions, as cases where the treatment hadn't been applied correctly, or where the patient's condition was too advanced for help. The astronomical component of medieval medicine added another layer of complexity and error. Physicians believed that the movements of planets and stars directly influenced human health. They would refuse to perform certain procedures when the stars were unfavourable, sometimes letting patients die while waiting for a more auspicious moment. They prescribed different treatments based on the patient's birth sign, convinced that celestial forces determined how the body would respond to various remedies. Women faced particular challenges in this medical system. Female physicians were rare and often viewed with suspicion. When women did practice medicine, it was usually as midwives or herbalists, roles that were tolerated but not respected. Male physicians had elaborate theories about female anatomy that were completely divorced from reality, based more on religious doctrine than observation. The treatments they prescribed for women's ailments were often particularly brutal, designed to punish what they saw as the inherent weakness and sinfulness of the female body. The medieval medical system was remarkably resistant to change. New ideas were viewed with suspicion, especially if they contradicted ancient authorities. Physicians who suggested that observation and experimentation might be more reliable than classical texts were dismissed as dangerous innovators. The entire structure of medical education was designed to preserve and transmit existing knowledge, not to discover new truths. And yet, people kept seeking medical help, kept paying enormous fees for treatments that made them worse, kept believing that the next physician or the next remedy might finally provide the cure they desperately needed. The alternative, accepting that illness was beyond human control, was too frightening to contemplate. Better to believe in the illusion of medical knowledge than to face the reality of helplessness. This faith in medical authority, despite overwhelming evidence of its failures, reveals something fundamental about human nature. We want to believe that someone, somewhere, understands what's happening to our bodies and knows how to fix it. We're willing to endure almost any treatment if it comes with confident explanations and promises of cure. The medieval physician, with his elaborate theories and expensive remedies, provided exactly what people needed psychologically, even as he destroyed them physically. The irony is that many patients probably would have recovered faster if they'd been left alone. The irony is that many patients probably would have recovered faster if they'd been left alone. But medieval medicine wasn't just about individual physicians making individual mistakes. It was an entire system built on a foundations of sand, propped up by institutions that had every incentive to keep the delusion alive. The medieval hospital, such as it was, embodied this contradiction perfectly. These weren't places of healing in any sense we'd recognized. They were warehouses for the dying, managed by monks who meant well but understood nothing about disease. The typical hospital ward was a long, drafty hall filled with beds arranged so patients could see the altar during services, because spiritual healing was considered far more important than physical recovery. Patients were crammed together regardless of their ailments. Someone with a broken leg might share a bed with a person dying of plague. The concept of contagion existed, but it was understood backwards. Medieval physicians believed that disease spread through bad air, through corrupted humours that could somehow jump between bodies. They had no idea that the very act of packing sick people together was creating the perfect conditions for epidemics. The daily routine in these hospitals was rigid and religious. Patients were awakened before dawn for prayers. They received communion regularly, whether they wanted it or not. Their spiritual needs were meticulously attended to, while their physical needs were largely ignored. Food was provided, but it was often the same gruel regardless of the patient's condition. Someone recovering from surgery received the same thin soup as someone with a fever, because the idea that different illnesses might require different nutrition was alien to medieval thinking. The monks who ran these institutions were sincere in their desire to help. They genuinely believed they were serving God by caring for the sick, but their training was theological, not medical. They could recite scripture from memory but couldn't recognize the signs of infection. They knew the proper prayers for every saint but had no idea how to clean a wound properly. When actual physicians visited these hospitals, which was rare, they brought their full arsenal of harmful treatments. Bloodletting was performed on entire wards at once, like a bizarre religious ritual. Patients were purged en masse, filling the air with the sounds and smells of collective suffering. The physicians would make their rounds, pronouncing confidently on each case, prescribing elaborate remedies that the hospital couldn't afford and wouldn't have helped anyway. The apothecaries who supplied these remedies were another link in the chain of medieval medical failure. These were the pharmacists of their day, skilled craftsmen who prepared the complex compounds prescribed by physicians. They had extensive knowledge of plants, minerals, and animal products. They could create beautiful pills and powders, carefully measured and elegantly packaged, but they had no understanding of how these substances actually affected the human body. An apothecary's shop was a wonderland of exotic ingredients. Jars lined the shelves, filled with everything from ground pearls to powdered mummy flesh. Yes, actual mummies were imported from Egypt, ground up, and sold as medicine. The logic was that since mummies were preserved, they must contain some essence of preservation that could be transferred to the living. The fact that this made no sense didn't matter. It was expensive, exotic, and therefore assumed to be powerful. The preparation of these remedies was as much ritual as chemistry. Apothecaries would consult astrological charts to determine the best time to mix their compounds. They believed that the planetary alignments affected the potency of their medicines. A remedy prepared during a favourable conjunction of Mars and Jupiter was thought to be more powerful than one mixed at random. This added weeks to the preparation time and enormous cost to the final product, but it gave customers confidence that they were receiving something special. The most expensive remedies were those that required the most exotic ingredients. Bezoar stones formed in the stomachs of certain animals were prized as antidotes to poison. Unicorn horn, usually narwhal tusk, was ground into powder and sold at astronomical prices. The rarer and more expensive an ingredient, the more faith people placed in its healing properties. This created a perverse incentive system where the least effective treatments were often the most costly. Physicians themselves were trapped in this system as much as their patients. They had spent years studying ancient texts, memorizing complex theories, learning to speak with authority about subjects they didn't understand. Their entire identity was built on this knowledge. To admit that it was wrong would be to admit that their education was worthless, their expertise was fake, their entire profession was built on lies. So they doubled down. When treatments failed, they blamed the patient's constitution, the unfavourable stars, the corrupted air. They prescribed more bloodletting, stronger purges, more exotic remedies. They created elaborate explanations for why their theories were correct, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. They developed a professional language so complex and specialised that lay people couldn't challenge their authority. The universities that trained these physicians were equally invested in maintaining the system. Medical schools were prestigious institutions that attracted wealthy students and generous donations. They had beautiful buildings, extensive libraries, learned professors who commanded respect throughout society. All of this was built on the foundation of ancient medical texts that were fundamentally wrong. The curriculum was designed to produce physicians who could recite Galen and Avicenna perfectly, who could calculate astrological influences with mathematical precision, who could diagnose any ailment by examining urine. Students spent years memorizing these skills, taking pride in their ability to quote classical authorities from memory. The idea that they should observe actual patients, experiment with different treatments, or question ancient wisdom was not just discouraged, but actively suppressed. Medical examinations tested students' knowledge of theory, not their ability to heal. A student who could perfectly recite the four humours and their properties would pass with honours, even if he had never successfully treated a patient. One who achieved remarkable cures through unorthodox methods would be failed for deviating from established doctrine. The system rewarded conformity and punished innovation. The licensing of physicians was controlled by these same institutions. To practice medicine legally, you needed their approval. This created a closed system where only those who accepted the established theories could enter the profession. Alternative healers, folk practitioners, and anyone who challenged orthodox medicine were branded as quacks and charlatans, even if their treatments were more effective. The economic incentives were equally perverse. Physicians charged enormous fees for their services, fees that only the wealthy could afford. But their treatments were often more harmful than helpful, which meant that patients required repeated visits, ongoing treatments, and ever more expensive remedies. A physician who actually cured his patients quickly would soon find himself without income. One who kept them sick but hopeful could build a thriving practice. This created a medical system that was actively harmful to public health. The more money you had, the more likely you were to receive treatments that would make you worse. The poor, who couldn't afford physicians, often had better outcomes simply because they were left alone to recover naturally. But this irony was lost on medieval society, which assumed that expensive treatments must be better than cheap ones. The religious establishment played a crucial role in maintaining this system. The church taught that illness was often a punishment for sin, that suffering was spiritually beneficial, that miraculous cures were possible through faith and prayer. This created a framework where medical failure could always be explained away as God's will, where the patient's lack of faith could be blamed for treatment failures. At the same time, the church controlled much of the medical infrastructure. Monasteries were centres of learning where medical texts were copied and preserved. Monks served as healers in their communities, combining prayer with basic medical care. The church's authority lent legitimacy to the medical establishment, making it harder for people to question orthodox treatments. The result was a medical system that was remarkably stable and remarkably harmful. It persisted for centuries, causing immense suffering while presenting itself as humanity's best hope for healing. It was a perfect example of how institutions can become self-perpetuating, how the very people who should be most motivated to change a broken system can become its most ardent defenders. The patients who suffered under this system were not passive victims. They sought second opinions, tried alternative treatments, sometimes rejected medical advice entirely. But they were fighting against centuries of accumulated authority, against institutions that claimed divine sanction for their methods, against a professional class that spoke in languages they couldn't understand, about concepts they couldn't challenge. Many chose to endure the treatments because the alternative, accepting that medicine had no answers, was too frightening to contemplate. They wanted to believe that someone understood what was happening to their bodies, that there was a rational explanation for their suffering, that a cure was possible if they just found the right physician or the right remedy. This faith in medical authority, despite overwhelming evidence of its failures, reveals something profound about human psychology. We are willing to endure almost any treatment if it comes with confident explanations and promises of cure. We prefer harmful intervention to helpful neglect, elaborate theories to honest ignorance, expensive remedies to simple rest. The medieval medical system understood this psychology perfectly and exploited it ruthlessly. It offered exactly what people needed emotionally: confident explanations for mysterious illnesses, authoritative voices in times of crisis, hope in the face of despair, even as it systematically destroyed the bodies it claimed to heal. The truly insidious genius of medieval medicine wasn't just that it was wrong. It was that it was wrong in ways that felt profoundly right to everyone involved. The system had an answer for everything, a theory that could explain any symptom, a treatment that addressed every concern. It was intellectually satisfying in a way that truth rarely is. When a patient died after bloodletting, it wasn't because the treatment was harmful, it was because the corrupted humours had been allowed to fester too long before treatment began. When someone recovered despite receiving no medical care, it wasn't because the body had healed itself. It was because the natural balance of humours had been temporarily restored through divine intervention. Every outcome could be explained within the framework, which made the framework seem unshakable. The language of medieval medicine was deliberately obscure, filled with Latin terms and Greek concepts that ordinary people couldn't understand. This wasn't accidental. A physician who spoke in plain language about simple remedies would seem less impressive than one who diagnosed an imbalance of sanguine temperament requiring phlebotomy during the waxing moon. The more incomprehensible the explanation, the more confidence it inspired. Patients often felt better immediately after seeing a physician, not because the treatment worked, but because they finally had an explanation for their suffering. The human mind craves narrative, seeks meaning in chaos. Medieval medicine provided elaborate stories about what was happening inside the body, complete with heroes and villains, battles between opposing forces, and clear paths to victory. These stories were almost always false, but they were psychologically comforting. The diagnostic process itself was a form of theatre. The physician would arrive with great ceremony, examine the patient's urine with intense concentration, consult his charts and instruments, and then pronounce his findings with absolute certainty. The patient's family would gather around, hanging on every word, desperate for any sign of hope. The physician became the star of this drama, the learned sage who could peer into the mysteries of the body and emerge with answers. The treatments that followed were often elaborate productions in their own right. Bloodletting required special bowls to catch the blood, precise cuts at specific locations, careful measurement of the amount removed. Purging involved complex preparations, careful timing, and detailed monitoring of the patient's response. These weren't simple procedures, but rituals that reinforced the physician's authority and the treatment's importance. The more painful and unpleasant the treatment, the more faith patients placed in its effectiveness. This perverse logic assumed that medicine should taste terrible, that healing should hurt, that anything pleasant or easy couldn't possibly be powerful enough to combat serious illness. Physicians understood this psychology and deliberately made their treatments as dramatic and uncomfortable as possible. The wealthy competed to hire the most famous physicians, the ones with the most elaborate theories and the most exotic remedies. A physician who could trace his knowledge back to ancient authorities, who could cite obscure texts and perform complex calculations, commanded higher fees and greater respect. Medical practice became a form of intellectual performance art, where the goal was to impress rather than heal. The poor, meanwhile, developed their own parallel system of healing. Village-wise women who knew which plants could ease pain, barber surgeons who could set bones and stitch wounds, midwives who understood the mysteries of birth and death. These practitioners had no formal training, no university degrees, no elaborate theories. They simply observed what worked and what didn't, passing their knowledge down through generations of trial and error. Ironically, this folk medicine was often more effective than the learned medicine of the universities. A village healer who prescribed willow bark for pain was using a remedy that actually contained salicin, the precursor to aspirin. A midwife who insisted on clean hands and boiled water was practicing better hygiene than physicians who moved from patient to patient without washing. But these practitioners were dismissed as ignorant by the medical establishment, their successes attributed to luck rather than skill. The division between learned and folk medicine created a bizarre situation where the most educated healers were often the most harmful, while the least educated were the most helpful. But social status and institutional authority trumped practical results. A university-trained physician who killed his patients through bloodletting was still considered more respectable than a village healer who saved lives through herbal remedies. The Church's role in perpetuating this system cannot be overstated. Religious doctrine taught that the body was a temporary vessel for the soul, that physical suffering was spiritually beneficial, that miraculous healing was possible through faith alone. This created a framework where medical failure could always be explained as God's will, where the patient's spiritual state was considered more important than their physical condition. Monasteries became centres of medical learning, but their approach was fundamentally different from what we might expect. Monks copied ancient texts faithfully, preserving errors along with genuine knowledge. They treated medicine as a branch of theology, where the goal was to understand God's plan rather than to cure disease. Prayer and penance were considered more powerful than any earthly remedy. The saints provided another layer of medical authority. Each had their specialty, their particular area of healing expertise. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Bartholomew for skin diseases, Saint Vitus for epilepsy. Patients would make pilgrimages to shrines, seeking miraculous cures through divine intervention. When healing occurred, it was credited to the saint's power. When it didn't, the patient's faith was found wanting. This religious framework made it nearly impossible to evaluate medical treatments objectively. Any cure could be attributed to divine favour, any failure to spiritual inadequacy. The physician's role became that of a religious intermediary, someone who could intercede with both earthly and heavenly powers on behalf of the patient. The medieval medical system was remarkably resistant to reform because it served so many different interests. Physicians gained wealth and prestige from their monopoly on healing. Universities attracted students and donations by teaching ancient wisdom. The Church maintained its authority over life and death. Patients received comfort and hope, even if not actual healing. Everyone had reasons to keep the system functioning regardless of its effectiveness. The rare individuals who questioned this system faced enormous pressure to conform. A physician who suggested that bloodletting was harmful would be accused of rejecting centuries of accumulated wisdom. A monk who proposed that observation was more reliable than ancient texts would be branded a heretic. A patient who refused treatment would be seen as refusing God's mercy. The economic structure of medieval medicine created additional barriers to change. Physicians charged enormous fees for their services, fees that reflected the supposed value of their ancient knowledge. To admit that this knowledge was worthless would be to admit that their fees were fraudulent. The entire professional class had a vested interest in maintaining the illusion of medical effectiveness. The guild system that regulated medical practice was equally conservative. These professional organizations controlled who could practice medicine, what treatments could be prescribed, and how much could be charged. They served as guardians of orthodox medical doctrine, ensuring that only those who accepted established theories could enter the profession. Innovation was not just discouraged, but actively suppressed. The result was a medical system that was perfectly designed to perpetuate itself while providing minimal benefit to patients. It was intellectually coherent, socially respected, economically profitable, and spiritually sanctioned. It had answers for every question, explanations for every failure, and hope for every desperate family. It was everything people wanted from medicine except the ability to actually heal. This system persisted for centuries, causing immense suffering while presenting itself as humanity's best hope for health. It was a perfect example of how institutions can become ends in themselves, how the very people who should be most motivated to change a broken system can become its most ardent defenders. The patients who suffered under this system were not merely victims of ignorance. They were participants in a complex social drama where everyone played their assigned role. The physician provided authoritative explanations, the patient demonstrated faith in received wisdom, the family showed proper respect for learning, and everyone maintained the fiction that medicine was a science rather than an elaborate form of magical thinking. The most tragic aspect of medieval medicine was not its failures but its successes, not the cures it provided, which were few and far between, but the comfort it offered to people facing the ultimate uncertainty of illness and death. It gave them something to do, someone to blame, and stories to tell about their suffering. It transformed the meaningless chaos of disease into a narrative with heroes and villains, battles and victories, hope and redemption. In this sense, medieval medicine was a form of therapy, not for the body but for the mind. It couldn't heal physical ailments, but it could ease psychological distress. It couldn't extend life, but it could provide meaning to death. It couldn't cure disease, but it could offer dignity to suffering. These were not small gifts in a world where such comforts were rare. The physicians who practiced this medicine were not monsters or charlatans, though some certainly were. Most were sincere believers in their own theories, convinced that they were serving humanity's highest interests. They had devoted their lives to mastering ancient wisdom, and they genuinely believed that this wisdom held the keys to healing. Their confidence was not feigned, but authentic, which made it all the more dangerous. The tragedy of medieval medicine was not that it was practiced by evil people, but that it was practiced by good people who were profoundly wrong about everything they thought they knew about the human body. The tragedy of medieval medicine was not that it was practiced by evil people, but that it was practiced by good people who were profoundly wrong about everything they thought they knew about the human body. The surgical practices of the medieval period reveal this tragedy in its most visceral form. Surgery was not a medical specialty, but a craft, practiced by barber surgeons who learned their trade through apprenticeship rather than formal education. These men were skilled with their hands, capable of setting bones and stitching wounds with remarkable dexterity, but they operated within the same theoretical framework as their university-trained colleagues, which meant that even their successes were often undermined by their understanding of how the body worked. A typical surgical procedure began with astrological consultation. The barber surgeon would consult his charts to determine whether the stars were favourable for the operation. Mars in the wrong position could doom the patient to excessive bleeding. A malevolent conjunction of Saturn and Mercury might cause the wound to putrefy. These calculations could delay surgery for weeks while the patient's condition worsened, but no surgeon would risk operating under unfavourable celestial conditions. The surgical instruments themselves were crude but effective. Knives, saws, and forceps that would serve their purpose if properly used. But the understanding of anatomy was so fundamentally flawed that even skilled craftsmen often cut in the wrong places, removed healthy tissue, or left diseased material behind. They worked from memory of ancient texts that described organs that existed only in the imagination of long-dead authorities. Anesthesia was primitive and dangerous. Patients were given mixtures of wine, opium, and various herbs that might dull the pain or might poison them outright. Many surgeons preferred to operate on conscious patients, believing that the body's natural responses provided important information about the success of the procedure. The screams of the patient were considered a good sign, indicating that the corrupted humours were being expelled, along with the patient's cries. The concept of sterile technique was not merely unknown, but actively opposed by medical theory. Surgeons believed that wounds needed to suppurate, to produce pus, in order to heal properly. They would deliberately introduce foreign substances into surgical sites to encourage this process. Clean wounds that healed without infection were considered abnormal, a sign that the body's natural healing processes were being suppressed. Post-operative care was guided by the same humoral theories that governed all medical practice. Patients were bled after surgery to prevent inflammation. They were purged to eliminate corrupted humours that might interfere with healing. Their wounds were dressed with compounds designed to promote suppuration rather than prevent infection. The fact that these treatments often led to complications was seen as proof that the patient's condition was more serious than initially believed. The barbershop where these procedures took place was a peculiar institution. It served as both grooming establishment and medical clinic, where customers could receive a haircut and a bloodletting in the same visit. The iconic barber pole, with its red and white stripes, symbolized the blood and bandages that were the surgeon's stock in trade. The same hands that trimmed beards would later extract teeth, set bones, and perform amputations. The apprenticeship system that trained these craftsmen was based on imitation rather than understanding. Young men learned to make precise cuts and tie neat sutures, but they also learned to accept without question the theoretical framework that guided their work. They memorized the proper prayers to recite during surgery, the correct phases of the moon for different procedures, and the appropriate herbs to prescribe for post-operative care. Innovation was discouraged, tradition was sacred. The guild system that regulated surgical practice was equally conservative. Master surgeons jealously guarded their secrets, passing them down only to carefully selected apprentices who had proven their loyalty to established methods. Competition was controlled, prices were fixed, and anyone who deviated from accepted practices could be expelled from the profession. The guilds served as guardians of orthodoxy, ensuring that surgical techniques remained unchanged for generations. The patients who submitted to these procedures were often desperate. They had exhausted all other options, tried every remedy, consulted every healer. Surgery was a last resort, undertaken only when the alternative was certain death. The survival rate was appalling, but those who did survive often attributed their recovery to the surgeon's skill rather than to luck or their own constitution. The relationship between surgeon and patient was complex and fraught. The surgeon possessed technical skills that the patient desperately needed, but he also wielded theories that were fundamentally harmful. He could remove a kidney stone with remarkable precision, but he might also prescribe bloodletting that would prevent the patient from recovering from the surgery. His competence and his ignorance were inseparably intertwined. The wealthier patients could afford better surgeons, men who owned finer instruments and had access to more exotic remedies. But wealth could not purchase better understanding of human anatomy or more effective treatments. The rich died from surgical complications just as readily as the poor, though they did so in more comfortable surroundings and with more elaborate explanations for their demise. The religious context of surgery added another layer of complexity. The Church taught that the body was sacred, that it bore the image of God, that it would be resurrected at the end of time. This created theological problems for procedures that involved cutting into flesh or removing organs. Surgeons had to navigate between medical necessity and religious doctrine, often seeking special dispensation from church authorities before performing certain operations. The fear of excommunication was real and powerful. A surgeon who performed an unauthorized procedure might find himself barred from the sacraments, condemned to spiritual death even as he tried to prevent physical death in others. This fear led to elaborate rituals of purification before and after surgery, prayers for divine guidance, and careful documentation of the religious justification for each procedure. The intersection of medicine and religion created bizarre situations where spiritual considerations outweighed medical ones. A surgeon might refuse to operate on a patient who had not confessed their sins, believing that the procedure would be doomed to failure if the patient's soul was not properly prepared. Conversely, a patient might refuse surgery on religious grounds, preferring to trust in divine healing rather than human intervention. The plague years revealed the complete inadequacy of medieval surgical knowledge. When the Black Death swept through Europe, surgeons tried to treat the bubonic swellings with their traditional methods. They cut open the buboes, drained the pus, and cauterized the wounds. They bled patients to reduce inflammation and purged them to eliminate corrupted humors. These treatments probably hastened death rather than preventing it, but they were all that medical theory could offer. The desperate search for effective treatments led to increasingly extreme measures. Surgeons tried cutting deeper, bleeding more extensively, purging more violently. They invented new procedures based on increasingly far-fetched theories about the nature of plague. They experimented with different combinations of herbs, different timing of treatments, different prayers and incantations. Nothing worked, but the failure was always attributed to external factors rather than to the inadequacy of the theoretical framework. The social impact of surgical practice extended far beyond the immediate relationship between surgeon and patient. Families bankrupted themselves paying for procedures that were more likely to harm than help. Communities lost productive members to surgical complications that could have been avoided with better understanding of anatomy and infection. The reputation of individual surgeons rose and fell based on chance outcomes rather than actual skill. The training of surgeons reflected the broader problems of medieval medical education. Students learned to perform procedures with mechanical precision, but they were never taught to question the reasoning behind those procedures. They memorized the proper technique for bloodletting, but never learned to evaluate whether bloodletting was actually beneficial. They became skilled craftsmen in service of a fundamentally flawed science. The instruments used in medieval surgery were often beautiful objects, crafted with the same care and attention to detail as works of art. Surgical knives were forged from the finest steel, their handles decorated with intricate carvings. Forceps were precisely calibrated to provide the perfect grip. Bone saws were balanced to cut with maximum efficiency. The irony was that these magnificent tools were being used to implement treatments that were often worse than useless. The documentation of surgical procedures was meticulous but misguided. Surgeons kept detailed records of their operations, noting the phase of the moon, the patient's astrological sign, the colour and consistency of the blood removed, and the prayers recited during the procedure. These records were considered valuable sources of medical knowledge to be studied and emulated by future generations. The fact that they documented systematic failure rather than systematic success was not recognised. The psychological impact of surgical practice on the surgeons themselves was profound. These were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work, who genuinely believed they were serving humanity's highest interests. The constant failure of their treatments, the high mortality rates, the suffering they witnessed daily, all of this took a toll that was rarely acknowledged. Some turned to alcohol, others to increasingly desperate theories about why their treatments weren't working. A few simply gave up and found other occupations. The evolution of surgical instruments over time reveals the persistence of flawed thinking. New tools were designed to implement old theories more efficiently rather than to test whether those theories were correct. A more precise bloodletting device was considered an advance, even if bloodletting itself was harmful. A sharper knife for trepanation was seen as progress, even if drilling holes in skulls served no medical purpose. The international exchange of surgical knowledge spread errors as efficiently as innovations. When a surgeon in Paris developed a new technique for treating kidney stones, the method would quickly spread to London, Rome, and Prague. But if the technique was based on faulty understanding of anatomy, the spread of knowledge simply multiplied the opportunities for harm. The medieval world was remarkably efficient at disseminating medical misinformation. The economic incentives in surgical practice were perverse. Surgeons were paid for performing procedures, not for achieving successful outcomes. A surgeon who could convince patients to undergo multiple operations would earn more than one who achieved cures with minimal intervention. This created a system where the most harmful practitioners were often the most prosperous, while those who did the least damage earned the least money. The relationship between surgical practice and the broader medical establishment was complex and sometimes antagonistic. University-trained physicians looked down on barber surgeons as mere craftsmen, lacking the theoretical knowledge that came from studying ancient texts. But the surgeons had practical experience that the physicians lacked, hands-on knowledge of what the inside of the human body actually looked like. This tension between theory and practice was never resolved, leaving both groups operating with incomplete understanding. The legacy of medieval surgery was not its few successes, but its systematic failures. Generations of patients suffered and died under the care of skilled craftsmen who were guided by fundamentally flawed theories. The tragedy was not that these surgeons were incompetent, but that they were competent practitioners of an incompetent science. Their skill with their hands was undermined by their ignorance of what those hands were actually doing. The medieval surgical patient faced a cruel paradox. The very act of seeking help increased their chances of harm. The more skilled the surgeon, the more likely they were to implement harmful treatments with devastating efficiency. The wealthier the patient, the more likely they were to afford procedures that would make their condition worse. In a world where medical knowledge was systematically wrong, medical ignorance was often a blessing. The instruments of healing had become instruments of harm, wielded by good people who believed they were serving the highest calling of their age. The surgical knife, sharp and precise, cut through flesh and bone with equal efficiency, whether it was saving life or ending it. The difference lay not in the skill of the hand that held it, but in the knowledge that guided that hand. And in medieval Europe, that knowledge was profoundly, systematically, tragically wrong. The monastery infirmary was supposed to be a place of healing, but it more closely resembled a warehouse for the dying. Long stone halls echoed with coughs and groans, their vaulted ceilings designed to inspire thoughts of heaven rather than recovery. The monks who tended these halls were devout men, sincere in their desire to serve God through caring for the sick. But their training was in scripture, not medicine, and their understanding of the human body was filtered through theological doctrine rather than observation. Brother Anselm, the infirmarian at the monastery of St. Bartholomew, had memorized every psalm and could recite the liturgy of the hours without error. He knew the feast days of obscure saints and could debate fine points of doctrine with visiting scholars. What he didn't know was that the practice of bleeding patients who were already weak from illness was killing them faster than their original ailments. But then, no one had taught him to think in terms of cause and effect when it came to bodily suffering. The monastery's medical library was impressive, filled with carefully copied texts that preserved centuries of accumulated error. The scribes who had produced these manuscripts were skilled craftsmen, their illuminated letters works of art that would survive long after the medical knowledge they decorated had been forgotten. But they were copying ideas, not testing them. A scribe might spend months reproducing a treatise on the healing properties of ground unicorn horn without ever wondering whether unicorns actually existed. The daily routine in the infirmary was rigid and religious. Patients were awakened before dawn for prayers, their spiritual needs attended to before their physical ones. The assumption was that illness was fundamentally a spiritual problem, that the body's corruption reflected the soul's condition. This created a framework where medical failure could always be explained as divine judgment, where the patient's lack of faith could be blamed for treatment failures. The monks had developed elaborate rituals around the administration of medicine. Herbs were blessed before being administered, prayers were recited over sick beds, and holy water was sprinkled on wounds. These ceremonies gave both patient and caregiver a sense that something meaningful was being done, that the forces of good were being marshalled against the forces of disease. The fact that these rituals had no medical efficacy was irrelevant to their psychological power. The concept of contagion was understood in medieval monasteries, but backwards. The monks believed that disease spread through moral corruption, that sin was literally infectious. They would isolate patients not to prevent the spread of microorganisms, but to contain spiritual pollution. A man with leprosy was segregated not because his disease was communicable, but because his visible affliction was evidence of inner corruption that might contaminate others spiritually. The herbal gardens that supplied monastic medicine were carefully tended and impressively organized. Each plant had its designated purpose, its traditional use, its associated prayer. The monks who cultivated these gardens possessed genuine botanical knowledge, understanding which plants grew best in which conditions, how to harvest them for maximum potency, and how to preserve them through the winter months. But their understanding of how these plants affected the human body was based on theory rather than observation. The preparation of medicines in the monastery was a sacred act. The brother apothecary would begin each day with prayers asking for divine guidance in his work. He would carefully measure ingredients according to ancient recipes, combining herbs, minerals, and animal products in proportions that had been unchanged for centuries. The resulting compounds were often beautiful to look at, carefully crafted and elegantly presented. Whether they actually helped patients recover was a question that rarely occurred to anyone. The monastery's approach to surgery was cautious to the point of paralysis. The Church's teaching about the sanctity of the human body made invasive procedures theologically problematic. A monk who cut into flesh was tampering with God's creation, potentially damaging the temple of the Holy Spirit. This led to elaborate consultations with church authorities before any surgical procedure, delays that often proved fatal to patients who might have been saved by prompt intervention. When surgery was finally authorized, it was performed with great ceremony and extensive spiritual preparation. The patient would be shriven, their sins confessed and absolved. The surgical instruments would be blessed, prayers would be recited, and the entire procedure would be conducted under the watchful eyes of senior monks who could ensure that proper religious protocols were followed. The actual medical effectiveness of the surgery was secondary to its spiritual correctness. The monastery's record-keeping was meticulous but misguided. Every patient's spiritual condition was carefully documented, their sins catalogued, their progress towards salvation monitored. But their physical symptoms were often ignored or misunderstood. A monk might record that a patient had confessed to pride and been given appropriate penance, while failing to note that the same patient was showing signs of infection that could have been treated with proper care. The relationship between monastery and secular medicine was complex and often antagonistic. University-trained physicians viewed the monks as ignorant amateurs, lacking the theoretical knowledge that came from studying classical texts. But the monks had practical experience that the physicians lacked, years of observing patients and administering treatments. Neither group was willing to learn from the other, each convinced that their approach was superior. The economic aspect of monastic medicine was supposedly different from secular practice. The monks took vows of poverty and were not supposed to profit from their healing activities, but the monastery itself benefited enormously from its reputation as a place of healing. Wealthy patients left generous donations, noble families endowed chapels, and pilgrims brought offerings that helped fund the monastery's operations. The monks might not personally profit from medical practice, but their institution certainly did. The pilgrimage aspect of monastic medicine added another layer of complexity. Patients would travel hundreds of miles to seek healing at shrines associated with particular saints. The journey itself was considered part of the cure, a physical manifestation of spiritual dedication. Many pilgrims died on the road, weakened by travel and exposure. But their deaths were seen as martyrdom rather than medical failure, evidence of their devotion rather than the inadequacy of the treatments they sought. The relics housed in monastery churches were central to the healing process. These were supposedly fragments of saints' bodies, pieces of the true cross, or objects that had touched holy figures. Patients would touch these relics, kiss them, or sleep near them, believing that the saints' power would flow into their diseased bodies. The fact that relics were often fake, manufactured to meet demand, was irrelevant to their perceived efficacy. The monastery's approach to mental illness was particularly problematic. The monks understood madness as demonic possession, requiring exorcism rather than medical treatment. Patients with mental disorders were often chained, beaten, or subjected to other forms of physical abuse that were supposed to drive out evil spirits. The idea that mental illness might have natural rather than supernatural causes was alien to monastic thinking. The seasonal rhythms of monastic medicine reflected the agricultural calendar rather than medical necessity. Certain treatments were prescribed only during specific times of year, not because they were more effective then, but because ancient authorities had declared them appropriate to particular seasons. A patient with pneumonia might be denied treatment in summer because lung ailments were considered winter diseases, regardless of their actual condition. The monastery's relationship with female patients was complicated by religious doctrine about women's spiritual nature. Women were considered more susceptible to sin, more likely to be deceived by Satan, and generally inferior to men in spiritual matters. This theological framework affected their medical treatment, with female patients often receiving less attention and being subjected to more punitive treatments than men with similar conditions. The training of new monks in medical matters was haphazard and inconsistent. Some learned by watching experienced brothers, others by reading ancient texts, still others by trial and error on actual patients. There was no standardized curriculum, no systematic approach to medical education. A monk might become skilled at treating certain conditions through years of practice while remaining completely ignorant about others. The monastery's approach to childbirth was particularly dangerous. The monks understood labour as God's punishment for Eve's sin, believing that women should suffer during delivery as part of their spiritual penance. This led to a reluctance to provide pain relief or intervene in difficult births. Many women and infants died in monastery infirmaries that could have been saved with proper obstetrical care. The plague years revealed the complete inadequacy of monastic medicine. When the Black Death swept through Europe, monasteries were devastated. Their understanding of disease as spiritual corruption left them helpless against a purely biological threat. They responded with increased prayer, more rigorous penance, and desperate attempts to appease an apparently angry God. The fact that their treatments were ineffective was seen as evidence of humanity's sinfulness rather than their own ignorance. The psychological impact of monastic medicine on the monks themselves was profound. These were men who had dedicated their lives to serving God and helping others. the constant failure of their treatments, the high mortality rates among their patients, the suffering they witnessed daily. All of this challenged their faith and their understanding of divine providence. Some concluded that they were being tested by God, others that their patients were beyond earthly help. The monastery's interaction with folk healers was officially hostile but practically complex. The church condemned traditional healing practices as superstition or witchcraft, but many monks privately consulted local wise women or incorporated folk remedies into their treatments. This created an underground network of medical knowledge that operated parallel to official church doctrine, sometimes more effectively than the authorized treatments. The architectural design of monastery infirmaries reflected theological rather than medical priorities. Wards were arranged so that patients could see the altar during services, ensuring that their spiritual needs were met, even if their physical ones were not. The emphasis was on preparing souls for the next world, rather than healing bodies for continued life in this one. This architectural theology literally shaped the space where healing was supposed to occur. The monastery's medical library was both treasure and curse. It preserved ancient knowledge that might otherwise have been lost, but it also perpetuated errors that prevented medical progress. The monks who copied these texts were skilled scribes but not medical practitioners. They reproduced mistakes along with genuine insights, creating a body of literature that was internally consistent but externally wrong. The daily prayers in the monastery infirmary were carefully structured to address every aspect of spiritual healing. There were prayers for the dying, prayers for the suffering, prayers for the healers themselves, but there were no prayers for understanding. No requests for divine guidance in evaluating whether treatments were actually working. The assumption was that the treatments were correct because they were traditional, that failure was due to human sinfulness rather than medical ignorance. The monastery's approach to epidemic disease was based on collective guilt rather than individual treatment. When plague struck, the entire community would engage in intensive prayer, fasting, and penance. The idea was that disease was God's punishment for sin, that it could only be lifted through communal repentance. This approach ignored the practical measures that might have limited the spread of infection, focusing instead on spiritual solutions to biological problems. The relationship between monastic medicine and secular authority was often tense. Kings and nobles who fell ill expected the best available treatment, but they also expected it to be provided within acceptable religious frameworks. This created impossible situations where political necessity conflicted with theological doctrine, where the need to heal conflicted with the need to maintain religious orthodoxy. The monastery's record of medical failures was impressive but never acknowledged. Generations of patients had died under monastic care, their deaths carefully recorded but never analysed. The monks kept detailed accounts of spiritual progress but paid little attention to physical outcomes. They could tell you which patients had achieved salvation, but not which treatments had actually worked. The tragedy of monastic medicine was not that it was practiced by evil men, but that it was practiced by good men who were systematically wrong about everything they thought they knew about healing. Their sincere desire to serve God and help others was undermined by their complete misunderstanding of how the human body actually worked. They were skilled practitioners of a fundamentally flawed science, craftsmen in service of a broken system. The monastery infirmary was a place where faith and medicine intersected in ways that were psychologically comforting but medically disastrous. It offered hope to the hopeless, meaning to the suffering, and dignity to the dying. But it also offered treatments that were more likely to harm than heal, administered by men who genuinely believed they were serving humanity's highest interests. The monastery was both sanctuary and trap, a place where the sick came seeking healing and too often found only a more elaborate way to die. The bells that mark the hours in the monastery courtyard also mark the passage of countless lives that might have been saved with better understanding, better treatments, better medicine. But the bells continued to ring, the prayers continued to be recited, and the patients continued to arrive, seeking healing in a place that offered everything except the one thing they truly needed. The monastery endured, its walls solid and its faith unshaken, while the bodies it was meant to heal crumbled into dust.